and thawing Arctic permafrost. Every fraction of a degree matters. So there it is again. This is my message. This is what I want you to focus on. So please tell me, how do you react to these numbers without feeling at least some level of panic?
Greta Thunberg has slammed Ursula von der Leyen, accusing her of betraying future generations in the fight against climate change. As world leaders make empty promises and fossil fuels continue to dominate the conversation, Thunberg's message is clear. The planet is on the brink, and the time for half measures is over. With every delay, the stakes get higher, and the people who will suffer the most are the ones who have done the least to cause the crisis. It's time to hold those in power accountable.
What is new and unprecedented about this mission is the scale and the nature of it, where we are mobilizing people from literally all over the world. And we are sailing with dozens of boats, coming back even stronger, because last time we were intercepted and detained, we were saying already back then that we will be coming back, and take that as a promise.
Before it's too late. This criticism comes after the European Union's introduction of the European Climate Law in 2020, a landmark policy that aims to make the EU climate neutral by 2050. While von der Leyen hailed the law as a crucial step forward, Thunberg was quick to dismiss it. She labeled the law a surrender and argued that it failed to meet the urgent needs of the climate crisis. Thunberg pointed out that while the law set ambitious goals for 2050, it lacked immediate binding measures that could bring about the drastic changes needed right now. In her eyes, the law's long-term targets were insufficient and provided little assurance that meaningful action would take place in the near future. The European Climate Law is a significant component of the EU's Green Deal, which is meant to reshape the European economy into one that is sustainable, low-carbon, and circular. However, while the EU's intentions have been clear, Thunberg and other climate activists have raised concerns about the lack of urgency in these plans. For Thunberg, the climate crisis is not something that can be solved with distant, non-binding targets. She believes that science demands immediate action to reduce emissions drastically and swiftly, rather than waiting decades for the desired changes to take effect. Von der Leyen has been a key figure in promoting the EU's environmental policies, including the Green Deal, which also aims to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 55% by 2030 compared to 1990 levels. While this is seen as a significant step forward, Thunberg has criticized the European Commission for failing to take the necessary immediate steps. For her, the focus should be on bold actions that curb emissions today, not merely on promises for the future. She has often expressed frustration with political leaders who make ambitious claims but fall short when it comes to real, enforceable actions that would make a difference in the fight against climate change. Thunberg's criticism of von der Leyen isn't just about the lack of concrete actions in the EU's climate policy. It's also about the wider political context in which these policies are created. She has frequently pointed to the influence of fossil fuel interests on policy decisions and how this undermines the genuine effort needed to tackle the climate crisis. Thunberg argues that the EU's climate goals are often undermined by its ongoing support for fossil fuel industries, including subsidies for oil, gas, and coal. This is seen as a direct contradiction to the ambitious climate goals set by von der Leyen and other EU leaders. The global climate movement has been gaining momentum, with millions of young people around the world joining Thunberg in demanding action from their governments. While Thunberg's criticisms are focused on the EU, they reflect a broader discontent with the pace of global climate action. Many activists and climate experts argue that the time for incremental changes has passed. Thunberg's position is that we need bold, immediate, and systemic changes to combat the climate crisis before it's too late. Her call to action has only become more urgent in recent years, as the impacts of climate change, rising temperatures, extreme weather events, and environmental degradation become ever more visible. In the years since the EU's climate law was passed, Thunberg has remained an outspoken critic of policies she sees as insufficient. Her platform has grown, and with it, her influence. She has addressed world leaders at the United Nations, marched alongside millions in climate strikes, and challenged the status quo in numerous public appearances. Throughout this time, she has remained steadfast in her belief that the fight against climate change must be seen as an existential struggle that requires immediate, drastic, and sustained action. While von der Leyen has defended the European climate law, arguing that it's a historic step towards climate neutrality, Thunberg's criticism underscores a broader debate about the effectiveness of current climate policies. The disagreement between Thunberg and von der Leyen is not just about the content of the European climate law itself, but also about how governments approach climate action more generally. Thunberg and her supporters argue that too many governments are prioritizing economic growth and political stability over the health of the planet and its inhabitants. In contrast, von der Leyen's supporters argue that her approach is pragmatic, recognizing the need for a gradual transition that balances environmental and economic needs. One of Thunberg's key concerns with von der Leyen's policies is that they offer no immediate solutions to the problems at hand. The 2050 target for net zero emissions, while ambitious, is far too distant to address the problems of today. As global temperatures continue to rise, extreme weather events become more frequent, and ecosystems face unprecedented levels of destruction. The need for immediate action is clear. Thunberg's call for a more immediate response is a call that has been echoed by climate scientists and activists worldwide. The urgency of the climate crisis demands immediate, large-scale efforts to drastically reduce emissions, invest in renewable energy, and implement policies that phase out fossil fuels. For Thunberg, it's not enough to have good intentions. Science demands action. She has said time and again that we are running out of time, and the policies that have been put in place so far are not enough to meet the challenge. Her criticism of Ursula von der Leyen and the European Commission reflects her frustration with what she sees as a lack of genuine commitment to the climate cause. Thunberg has made it clear that she will continue to challenge world leaders and demand that they act now to secure a livable future for all. The criticism from Greta Thunberg towards Ursula von der Leyen intensified significantly after the COP28 summit held in 2023. This global climate conference, which brought together world leaders, policymakers, and activists, resulted in an agreement that Thunberg described as toothless and insufficient. She did not hold back in expressing her discontent with the final text of the agreement, particularly because it included fossil fuels for the first time in the context of climate negotiations. For Thunberg, this inclusion was not just a minor setback. It represented a betrayal of the global commitment to reducing carbon emissions and limiting the rise in global temperatures. Her reaction to the agreement underscored her belief that world leaders were still prioritizing economic interests over the planet's future. COP28, which took place in the United Arab Emirates, was a significant summit because it marked a new chapter in international climate discussions. The involvement of fossil fuels in the final agreement was a contentious issue from the start. As countries face growing pressure to decarbonize their economies and commit to more ambitious climate targets, Thunberg and many others were concerned that the inclusion of fossil fuels would undermine these efforts. From Thunberg's perspective, this decision represented a compromise that weakened the fight against climate change. It made her feel that the commitments made by world leaders, including von der Leyen, were more about political appeasement than true, meaningful change. The inclusion of fossil fuels in the COP28 agreement came amid increasing concerns over the role of the fossil fuel industry in shaping global climate policy. Many activists, including Thunberg, have long argued that the influence of oil, gas, and coal companies on government decisions has been a major obstacle to meaningful action. Fossil fuel companies continue to exert significant power in political and economic circles, using their influence to delay or dilute climate policies that would threaten their profits. Thunberg has frequently pointed to this dynamic, arguing that any meaningful climate agreement must remove the influence of these industries from the policymaking process. For her, the inclusion of fossil fuels in the COP28 agreement was a direct reflection of this powerful lobbying effort The final agreement at COP28 failed to set clear, enforceable commitments to reduce emissions in the short term. Instead, the language was vague, and the timelines for achieving climate targets remained distant, with no firm action in place to ensure these targets would be met. Thunberg's criticism of the deal was not limited to its failure to eliminate fossil fuels from the text. She also condemned the lack of clear accountability mechanisms, which she saw as essential for ensuring that countries follow through on their promises. Thunberg emphasized that the urgency of the climate crisis required immediate action, not promises for decades into the future. The vague and often evasive language in the agreement, she argued, would only further delay the necessary actions needed to prevent catastrophic climate change. One of the main points Thunberg raised in her criticism was the lack of concrete action to address the root causes of climate change. She pointed out that while the agreement acknowledged the need for stronger action, it did not contain specific measures that would lead to immediate reductions in emissions. The inclusion of fossil fuels in the text, she argued, demonstrated that the political will to tackle the climate crisis was still lacking. World leaders, she said, were willing to make symbolic gestures, but were unwilling to take the difficult steps needed to phase out fossil fuels and transition to a clean, renewable energy future. Thunberg has been vocal about her belief that the world is running out of time to address the climate crisis. She frequently underscores the urgency of taking immediate action, as every year of delay leads to further environmental damage, including rising sea levels, more frequent and intense natural disasters, and the destruction of ecosystems. Her frustration with the COP28 agreement reflected the growing concern among climate activists that world leaders are not acting fast enough to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Thunberg has called for global leaders to face up to the reality of the crisis and act decisively to curb emissions. She believes that only by taking bold, immediate action can we hope to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, a target that has been endorsed by the scientific community as essential for avoiding the most catastrophic effects of climate change. Thunberg's criticisms of COP28 were not just about the agreement itself, but also about the way the summit was conducted. She has argued that the entire climate negotiation process has been hijacked by powerful corporate interests, which continue to prioritize short-term profits over long-term environmental sustainability. For her, this undermines the legitimacy of the entire process. Thunberg has been consistent in her message that the climate crisis requires systemic change, not piecemeal solutions that merely serve to maintain the status quo. She has pointed out that many of the world's largest polluters continue to receive subsidies and other forms of support, allowing them to delay the transition to cleaner energy sources. Thunberg has often called for a radical shift in the global economic system, one that prioritizes sustainability over profit. And she believes that this shift is crucial to addressing the climate emergency. The COP28 summit was also significant because it highlighted the tension between political leaders who are still focused on economic growth and those who are calling for a shift towards sustainability. Thunberg's criticism of the deal was a reflection of the broader divide between those who see economic development as compatible with environmental goals and those who argue that a complete overhaul of the global economy is necessary to combat climate change. Thunberg has consistently argued that the current economic model, which is based on endless growth and consumption, is incompatible with the urgent need to reduce emissions and protect the planet. For her, the only way to truly address the climate crisis is through a fundamental restructuring of the global economy, one that puts the health of the planet and its people at the forefront of decision-making. In her statements following COP28, Thunberg also emphasized the need for greater accountability and transparency in climate negotiations. She called for greater scrutiny of the decisions made at summits like COP28 and for the voices of young people, who are most affected by climate change, to be heard more clearly in these discussions. Thunberg has been a strong advocate for the inclusion of young people in climate decision-making, as she believes that the future of the planet is at stake and that young people will bear the brunt of the consequences of inaction. By involving young people in these conversations, Thunberg argues, world leaders can better understand the urgency of the situation and the need for real action. As the COP28 summit ended, Thunberg's criticism of the agreement was met with support from many climate activists and environmental organizations. Her message resonated with those who felt that the summit had failed to deliver on its promises, and that the global response to the climate crisis was still insufficient. Thunberg's call for immediate, bold action continues to drive her activism, and she has promised to keep pushing for climate justice, no matter how difficult the fight may be. Greta Thunberg's commitment to the fight against climate change goes beyond her public criticisms and speeches. She has long been involved in direct activism, using her platform and voice to challenge governments, corporations, and individuals who she believes are failing to act on the climate crisis. Her protests are a central part of her strategy to raise awareness and push for real action. One of the most striking examples of her activism occurred in 2024 when she was arrested during a protest in Brussels, Belgium. This protest was part of a larger campaign against European Union subsidies for fossil fuels, a practice Thunberg and many other environmental activists consider a major barrier to meaningful climate action. The protest, organized by the United for Climate Justice Coalition, highlighted a key contradiction within the EU's approach to climate change. While the EU has set ambitious targets to reduce emissions and transition to renewable energy, it continues to provide significant financial support to the fossil fuel industry. This funding is often in the form of subsidies, which many argue encourages the continued extraction and use of oil, and coal. Thunberg and the protesters argued that these subsidies undermine the EU's climate commitments and delay the transition to a clean energy future. The protesters, including Thunberg, called for an immediate cessation of these subsidies, demanding that the EU align its financial policies with its climate goals. Thunberg's arrest in Brussels was not a solitary act of defiance. It was part of a broader movement that has seen millions of young people around the world join in climate strikes and protests. These demonstrations, often inspired by Thunberg's own school strike for climate, have become a global phenomenon. They have highlighted the frustration of young people who feel that their futures are being compromised by the slow pace of government action on climate change. Thunberg's personal involvement in these protests underscores her deep commitment to the cause and her willingness to put herself on the line in order to demand change. In addition to her arrests and direct action, Thunberg has used her platform to amplify the voices of other climate activists and communities that are disproportionately affected by climate change. She has traveled to various parts of the world to speak with indigenous communities, youth activists, and others who are on the front lines of the climate crisis. By listening to these communities and highlighting their stories, Thunberg has helped bring greater attention to the inequalities that exist within the climate movement. Climate change is not experienced equally by all. While some regions and communities bear the brunt of its impacts, others, particularly those in wealthier countries, are better equipped to mitigate and adapt to these changes. Thunberg has also been vocal about the need for the climate movement to center justice and equity. She has pointed out that the wealthiest countries, which have historically been the largest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions, have a moral responsibility to do more to address the crisis. At the same time, she has called on those in the global south, who are often the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change, to be heard in the global climate conversation. Thunberg's work is not only about reducing emissions, but also about ensuring that the solutions to the climate crisis are fair and inclusive. One of the most significant aspects of Thunberg's activism is her ability to connect with young people around the world. Her climate strikes have inspired millions of students to take action and demand climate justice. Thunberg has been clear that young people have the most to lose from inaction on climate change, and she has called on them to continue pushing for bold, transformative changes. Her message has resonated deeply with young people who are concerned about their futures, and her leadership in the climate strikes has helped amplify the demands for urgent action. Thunberg's direct action and activism are not just about protesting. They are part of a larger effort to shift the narrative around climate change. For Thunberg, the fight against climate change is not just an environmental issue. It is a moral and ethical issue that calls for urgent action. She has emphasized that the climate crisis is not something that can be solved with incremental changes or half-hearted commitments. Instead, it requires a radical shift in how we think about our economy, our energy systems, and our relationship with the planet. Thunberg's activism is built on the belief that we must move beyond the political and economic structures that have caused the climate crisis in the first place. Her call for radical change is rooted in a deep sense of urgency and the recognition that there is no time to waste. Her activism has not been without its challenges. As one of the most prominent figures in the global climate movement, Thunberg has faced significant criticism from politicians, media outlets, and individuals who disagree with her message. She has been accused of being too radical, too idealistic, and even of being a puppet of environmental organizations. Some have dismissed her as a naive young person who doesn't understand the complexities of politics and economics. However, Thunberg has consistently responded to these criticisms with poise and clarity, emphasizing that the climate crisis is not a political issue, but a scientific and moral one. She has argued that, while there may be disagreements on how to address climate change, the urgency of the situation should unite people across political divides. Despite the challenges she faces, Thunberg's activism has brought about tangible results. Her school strike movement has become a global phenomenon, with young people around the world organizing their own climate strikes and demanding action from their governments. Her speeches at international summits and her direct actions have also garnered significant media attention, helping to raise awareness about the climate crisis and put pressure on political leaders to act. Thunberg's ability to mobilize young people and inspire global movements is one of the reasons why she has become such a powerful force in the climate movement. Thunberg's involvement in protests and her willingness to get arrested in the name of climate justice reflect her deep sense of responsibility. She understands that the fight for a livable future requires sacrifice, and she is willing to make that sacrifice in order to push for meaningful change. Her actions have inspired countless others to join the fight, and her message has resonated deeply with people who are concerned about the future of the planet. Thunberg's activism is a reminder that change is possible, but it requires the collective will of individuals, communities, and governments to take action now. Looking ahead, Thunberg has shown no signs of slowing down. She has made it clear that her fight for climate justice will continue as long as the climate crisis remains unaddressed. As the world faces an ever-worsening climate crisis, Thunberg's activism serves as a powerful reminder that we must all take responsibility for the future of the planet. Through her protests, her speeches, and her leadership, Thunberg has inspired a generation to rise up and demand the action that is needed to protect the Earth for future generations. Her activism is not just about addressing climate change. It is about ensuring that the voices of those most affected by the crisis are heard, and that justice is at the heart of all climate solutions. Greta Thunberg's message and activism have consistently focused on demanding urgent, immediate, and bold action to address the climate crisis. Her unwavering belief in the need for systemic change is central to her approach. For Thunberg, the fight against climate change is not a distant challenge to be solved over the course of decades, but an immediate existential threat that requires us to act now. This belief is a core part of her advocacy, as she continues to push for policies and actions that respond to the climate crisis with the urgency it deserves. Thunberg's activism is grounded in her view that the time for gradual change has passed. She has consistently emphasized that the window for avoiding the worst impacts of climate change is rapidly closing. With each passing year, Thunberg has raised her voice louder, calling on world leaders to step up and take real action before the impacts of climate change become irreversible. Her call for immediate action stems from the mounting evidence of climate change's devastating effects across the world. The increasingly frequent and severe natural disasters, including wildfires, floods, and storms, as well as the rising global temperatures and melting ice caps, have made it clear that the world cannot afford to delay meaningful action any longer. Thunberg has pointed out that the climate crisis is already here, and it is disproportionately affecting the most vulnerable people, including low-income communities, indigenous peoples, and future generations. These communities are already bearing the brunt of climate change, even though they have contributed the least to its causes. Thunberg's message is clear. Those who have caused the crisis, wealthy countries and corporations, must take responsibility and take immediate action to address it. Thunberg has made it a point to hold political leaders accountable for their inaction on climate change. She has been particularly vocal about the shortcomings of world leaders like Ursula von der Leyen, whose actions and policies, according to Thunberg, have fallen short of the necessary steps to address the climate emergency. Despite the European Union's ambitious climate laws and commitments, Thunberg has argued that these policies are not enough. She has repeatedly called on von der Leyen and other world leaders to not only set ambitious goals, but also to implement immediate binding actions that will result in tangible changes. For Thunberg, the promises made by world leaders at international summits like COP28 are insufficient unless accompanied by concrete and enforceable measures that bring real change. One of the key aspects of Thunberg's activism is her call for accountability. She believes that governments and corporations must be held accountable for their role in driving the climate crisis and for their failure to take decisive action. This is particularly important in light of the large subsidies and financial support that fossil fuel companies continue to receive, despite the EU's climate commitments. Thunberg has argued that these subsidies are a direct contradiction to the EU's climate goals and must be eliminated immediately. She has also called for a comprehensive assessment of the role that fossil fuel companies play in influencing policy decisions and undermining climate action. Without addressing the financial and political power of these companies, Thunberg believes that true progress on climate change will be impossible. Beyond just holding leaders and corporations accountable, Thunberg has also emphasized the need for a just and equitable transition to a sustainable future. She has pointed out that the climate crisis disproportionately impacts the global south, where communities are often the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. These communities have contributed the least to global emissions, yet they are bearing the greatest burden. Thunberg's call for climate justice is rooted in the belief that any solutions to the climate crisis must prioritize the needs and voices of those who are most affected by it. She has been vocal about the need to include marginalized communities in climate decision-making and to ensure that they are not left behind in the transition to a sustainable world. Thunberg has also consistently called for a radical transformation of the global economic system. She believes that the current economic model, which prioritizes growth and profit above all else, is incompatible with the need to address the climate crisis. The pursuit of endless growth, she argues, is one of the primary drivers of environmental destruction, as it leads to increased resource extraction, carbon emissions, and environmental degradation. Thunberg's vision for a sustainable future is one that moves away from this growth-based model and instead focuses on well-being, social equity, and environmental sustainability. She advocates for a more holistic approach to economic and social development that takes into account the health of the planet and its ecosystems, as well as the well-being of all people. At the heart of Thunberg's activism is her unwavering belief in the power of collective action. She has always emphasized that climate change is not an issue that can be solved by individuals acting alone, but requires coordinated action from governments, businesses, and individuals working together. Thunberg's school strike movement, which began in 2018, has been a powerful example of how collective action can inspire change. Her strikes, which began as a solo protest outside the Swedish parliament, have since sparked a global movement, with millions of young people around the world participating in climate strikes and demanding climate justice. Thunberg has used her platform to empower young people and encourage them to take action, reminding them that they are the ones who will inherit the planet and that their voices matter. Her advocacy for collective action is also reflected in her support for grassroots movements and community-led initiatives. Thunberg believes that real change often comes from the ground up, as communities and individuals mobilize to demand change. She has consistently supported movements led by Indigenous peoples, youth activists, and others who are at the forefront of the climate struggle. These movements, Thunberg argues, are often the most effective in driving change because they are rooted in the lived experiences of those most affected by climate change. Thunberg's call for collective action also extends to the private sector. She has been outspoken in calling on corporations to take responsibility for their role in driving the climate crisis. While governments have a critical role to play in addressing the crisis, Thunberg argues that corporations, particularly those in the fossil fuel and industrial sectors, must also take responsibility for their environmental impact. She has pointed out that many large corporations continue to profit from the extraction and burning of fossil fuels, despite the fact that these activities are contributing to the destruction of the planet. Thunberg has called for companies to adopt sustainable practices, reduce their carbon footprints, and invest in clean energy alternatives. The urgency of Thunberg's message is clear. We cannot afford to wait any longer to take meaningful action on climate change. The longer we delay, the more difficult it will become to prevent the most catastrophic effects of global warming. Thunberg's activism serves as a wake-up call for world leaders and citizens alike, reminding us that the climate crisis is an immediate threat that requires bold action, not just words. Her activism continues to inspire millions around the world, particularly young people, to join the fight for climate justice. As she often reminds us, the future of the planet is at stake, and it is up to all of us to act now before it's too late. Thunberg's unwavering commitment to the climate cause is a powerful testament to the power of youth-led movements and the determination needed to address the climate emergency head-on.